Hello, everyone. Today we're going to step right into a moment that, for me, will always feel like a thunderclap in an otherwise ordinary sky. It was a Tuesday afternoon, one of those forgettable days when the world feels on autopilot. I remember sitting at my small kitchen table, a half-finished cup of tea cooling beside me, sunlight spilling lazily through the curtains. Outside, the sound of a distant lawnmower hummed like a sleepy background track. Everything felt still. Then my phone rang. Not just a casual thinking of you call. This was the kind of ring that made your chest tighten before you even glanced at the screen. I looked down and saw my daughter's name. Her voice, when I answered, was trembling. She didn't waste a second on small talk. There was urgency, almost panic in her tone. "Mom, I need help. It's bad. Please." Her words hit like cold water. My mind raced ahead of her sentences, already building worst-case scenarios before she could explain. Was she in danger? Was she hurt? And beneath that panic was something quieter, more instinctive. I need to fix this. That's what a parent does, right? No hesitation, no conditions. You leap. She told me about a sudden crisis. Rent overdue, utilities threatening shut-off, a roommate who had unexpectedly left without paying their share. She said she'd tried everything, extra shifts, selling belongings, but she just couldn't cover it all. Her voice cracked, and I pictured her small apartment, the bare walls, the stress curling her shoulders forward. I remember feeling an ache deep in my chest. My mind went straight to when she was little, her small hand gripping mine at crosswalks, the way she'd press her forehead to mine when she was scared. That protective instinct was automatic, almost primal. I didn't think about my budget. I didn't think about how much I could realistically spare. I thought about my child, and I said, "I'll help you." As I hung up, I told myself it was just for now. Just until she could get back on her feet. A temporary patch over a rough moment. Parents do that all the time, right? But if I could go back, I would freeze myself right there in that kitchen. The tea still lukewarm, the afternoon still ordinary, and whisper a warning into my own ear. Be careful. This is the first thread in a web you won't see forming until you're trapped inside it. Still, in that moment, there was no hesitation. I pulled out my checkbook, logged into my bank, moved the money she needed. It felt like an act of love, pure and simple. What I didn't know was that this single act would open the door to 3 years of monthly transfers, escalating requests, and a truth so devastating it would change the way I saw my daughter forever. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me in the comments where and when you're watching this. I love knowing the stories we share travel to so many corners of the world. Because this isn't just a story about money. It's about trust, love, and the quiet ways those two things can be chipped away before you realize they're gone. And it all began with that phone call. The first time I sent her money, I told myself it was a one-off, a safety net for a storm that had blown in too fast for her to prepare. But just a few weeks later, my phone rang again. Same name on the screen, same tone in her voice. She started with gratitude, telling me how much my help had meant, how she would have been lost without it. Then, almost hesitantly, she slipped into the new problem. Her car had broken down, and she needed it to get to work. The repairs would cost more than she had. She promised she'd pay me back as soon as she could. I remember staring at the wall as she talked, the old clock ticking in the background like it was keeping score of my hesitation. I wanted to believe her. Of course I did. She's my daughter. And part of me thought, if she's still struggling, maybe she just hasn't had the chance to recover from the last hit. So I did it again. I sent the money. That's how the pattern began. Slow, almost invisible at first. Each request came wrapped in urgency, with just enough detail to make it sound unavoidable. A bill due tomorrow, a roommate who skipped rent, a work uniform that had to be bought immediately. Always the kind of problems where, if you didn't act fast, the consequences would spiral. And every time I helped, she was effusive in her thanks. "You're the only one I can count on," she'd say. "I don't know what I'd do without you." It felt good, in a strange way. like I was still the person she turned to, even though she was an adult now. By the end of the first year, I realized I had transferred money to her almost every single month. Sometimes it was a small amount, sometimes more than I could comfortably spare. My own savings began to dip, and I started paying my own bills with more caution. I told myself it was fine, that things would turn around soon. After all, she was working hard, right? But there were cracks I chose not to see. There was the time I sent her money for rent, only to find out later she'd gone to a concert that same weekend. Or when she claimed her phone had been stolen, yet I saw her post a selfie the next day from what looked suspiciously like the same device. I brushed those moments aside. She's stressed. She needs a little escape. That's what I told myself. It was easier than facing the alternative, that my daughter might not be entirely honest with me. Still, there was one night that stuck with me. I was balancing my checkbook, trying to stretch my grocery budget for the week, when I realized I'd spent more on her than on myself for 3 months in a row. My stomach twisted. I thought about saying something, about setting limits. But then my phone buzzed. It was a picture from her, smiling, holding a cup of coffee, a little heart emoji in the caption. The guilt melted, replaced with warmth. She's okay, I thought. That's all that matters. What I didn't understand then was that this wasn't a string of isolated favors. It was the start of a cycle, one I would keep feeding because I couldn't bear the thought of her struggling, even if it meant I would. And that's how the first year came and went. A blur of bank transfers, reassurances, and small doubts I kept pushing to the back of my mind, not knowing that they were quietly building into something I wouldn't be able to ignore forever. The second year began with a promise. Her promise, that things were going to change. It was New Year's Day, and she called me in unusually high spirits. She told me she'd found a new job with better pay, better hours, and a real chance to get ahead. She assured me that soon I wouldn't need to help her anymore. She even said she might start paying me back. I wanted to believe her. In fact, I clung to those words like they were a lifeline. I told myself this was the fresh start we both needed. For the first couple of months, things were quiet. No frantic calls, no urgent bank transfers. I breathed easier. My savings, though still bruised, wasn't shrinking quite so quickly. Then came March. She called late in the evening, her voice shaky. Her new job hadn't been what she expected. Long hours, difficult coworkers, and a paycheck that didn't quite match what she'd been promised. She'd fallen behind on rent again. "I hate asking, Mom," she said, "but if I don't cover it, I'll be out on the street." I told myself this was a temporary slip, a bump in the road. But the money I sent that night was bigger than usual, and when I looked at my own bank account afterward, I felt a flicker of worry I tried hard to ignore. That flicker became a steady pulse over the next few months. The requests became more frequent again. One month, it was an emergency vet bill for her cat. The next, her car insurance had lapsed, and she needed to get it reinstated immediately. Each problem had a story that sounded urgent, and each story came with the same undertone. If you don't help, something bad will happen. By summer, I was juggling her bills alongside my own. I cut back on dinners out. I postponed a small vacation I'd planned for myself. I even dipped into an emergency fund I'd worked years to build, something I swore I'd never touch unless my own life depended on it. But what made it worse wasn't just the money. It was the emotional weight. I started living in a constant state of readiness, half expecting her name to pop up on my phone with another urgent need. It was exhausting, like standing guard over a life that wasn't my own, always waiting for the next crisis to pull me in. Then came the day that lodged itself in my memory. I had just wired her money to cover what she said was a utility shutoff notice. Later that afternoon, scrolling through social media, I saw a photo she'd posted, laughing with friends at a trendy rooftop bar, cocktail in hand. My chest tightened. I zoomed in, studying every corner of that image. The smile on her face didn't belong to someone drowning in unpaid bills. It belonged to someone comfortable. I didn't confront her, not then. Instead, I sat with that image in my mind, a quiet unease growing into something heavier. But I told myself I was probably overthinking it. After all, she was my daughter. And love can make you doubt the evidence right in front of your eyes. By the time autumn rolled in, the financial strain wasn't just nibbling at the edges of my life. It was taking real bites. I'd started to notice my own bills stacking higher than they used to. Small things I never had to think twice about, like paying the electric bill in full or getting my car serviced, were now carefully weighed against what I'd already sent her that month. Sometimes I'd delay my own payments just to make sure she got what she needed on time. I told myself it was okay. That's what family does, right? But the truth was, there were nights I lay awake in the dark, running numbers in my head, wondering how much longer I could keep this up. The requests weren't always huge, but they were relentless. 100 here, 200 there. It all added up. And each time, her tone made it sound like the world would fall apart if I said no. I started to recognize the rhythm of these calls, the quick greeting, the hesitant sigh, the confession of some looming disaster, followed by the soft promise to make it up to me someday. But there were cracks showing, tiny, jagged ones. One day, she called asking for help with groceries. I sent the money immediately, picturing her scraping by on instant noodles and canned beans. Later that week, she sent me a text, a photo of her dinner, some extravagant takeout that couldn't have been cheap. I stared at it longer than I should have, my mind spinning. Then came the car story. She said she needed gas money to get to work. I sent it without hesitation. 2 days later, a friend of mine sent me a picture from a local festival. Bright lights, music, and right in the middle of it, my daughter, smiling with a funnel cake in her hand. I felt conflicted, angry, hurt, but also guilty for even feeling those things. Parents aren't supposed to keep score, but I couldn't shake the thought. Am I being used? My friends started noticing my exhaustion. Over coffee one morning, my oldest friend leaned in and asked, "Do you think she's telling you the whole truth?" I laughed it off, brushing her concern aside. "She's my daughter," I said, as if those 3 words were an impenetrable shield against deception. But privately, that question stuck. I began to notice how my calls with her had changed. We used to talk about life, memories, silly little things. Now, it felt like every conversation had a price tag attached to it, and I hated myself for even thinking that way. There was one moment, one I'll never forget, when I opened my banking app and saw the sum total of what I'd given her in the past year and a half. I felt my stomach drop. It was more than I'd spent on my own needs, my own future. And yet, when the phone rang again, I answered. Because even with all my doubts, all my unease, there was still that pull, that voice in my head saying, "What if this time she really does need you?" I didn't know it yet, but that question was going to cost me more than money. It was around the beginning of the 3rd year that the little doubts started to take a more solid shape, like shadows forming into something you could almost see clearly. They came as small, fleeting moments at first, a slip in her story, a detail that didn't quite match the one she'd told before. For example, she once called in tears about a broken water heater in her apartment. She said she'd been taking cold showers for days, that she just couldn't bear it anymore. I wired her the money immediately, because honestly, who could stand that in the middle of winter? But 2 days later, during a casual call, she mentioned how great her morning shower had been all week. I paused. "I thought your heater was broken?" I asked. There was a quick laugh, a hurried explanation about the landlord fixing it sooner than expected. The answer was neat, tidy, almost rehearsed. It wasn't proof of anything, but it wasn't nothing either. There were other moments too. Once, she told me she was down to her last $20 for food, so I sent her enough to stock her fridge. Later that same evening, I saw her post online about a spontaneous spa day with a friend. The caption read, "Treat yourself, you deserve it." I wanted to comment something sarcastic, but my fingers froze over the keyboard. Instead, I just stared at it, a sour taste in my mouth. I started keeping these little inconsistencies to myself, afraid that saying them out loud would make them too real. My own finances were stretched thinner than ever. I'd stopped making extra payments toward my mortgage, telling myself it was temporary. I postponed renewing my dental insurance because it was too much for now. I even started buying cheaper groceries, things I hadn't eaten in years, just so I could send her what she needed without dipping further into my savings. And yet, she never seemed to be climbing out of the hole she was in. No matter how much I sent, no matter how many emergencies I covered, another one was always right around the corner. Then there was the birthday call. She rang me, bubbly and excited, to tell me about the amazing weekend she'd had. Fancy dinners, a night out at a wine bar, even a little shopping spree. I laughed along with her, but deep down, I was stunned. Just a week earlier, she'd said she was barely holding things together. When I gently brought it up, her voice cooled instantly. "So now I can't enjoy my birthday without you making me feel bad?" she snapped. I apologized, immediately regretting I'd even asked. But the tension lingered, and I could feel her pulling away. That was when I realized something crucial. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control, and how the fear of losing her, of her cutting me out, was keeping me silent. I didn't know it yet, but the truth I was inching toward was far more tangled, far more deliberate than I had dared to imagine. The warnings from friends started as gentle nudges, tiny ripples on a surface I refused to disturb. It happened at book club one evening. We just finished discussing a novel about betrayal when one of the women, Linda, leaned toward me and said, "You know, sometimes love blinds us more than we realize." She didn't say my daughter's name, but her eyes told me exactly who she was thinking of. I smiled, brushed it off, changed the subject, but that sentence lodged itself in my mind like a thorn. A few weeks later, over lunch with my sister, the topic came up again. She'd noticed I'd been turning down family outings more often, always saying I needed to watch my spending. Eventually, she just came out with it. "Are you sure she's not taking advantage of you?" The words hit like a slap. I defended my daughter immediately, explaining all the reasons she needed help, all the struggles she'd been through. But underneath my defensive tone, there was a tremor. My sister saw it too. She reached across the table, covered my hand with hers, and said softly, "You can love someone and still see when they're hurting you." That night, I lay awake thinking about those words. Looking back, I realized the reason their comments stung so much wasn't because they were wrong. It was because they were brushing up against a truth I'd been working hard to avoid. I had built my own narrative, one where I was the loving, dependable parent, and she was the daughter doing her best to get by. Questioning that story meant questioning my role in it, and that was terrifying. The next ask came only days later. She called in a rush, saying she'd had an unexpected medical bill and didn't have enough to cover it. Without even thinking, I opened my banking app. The transfer went through in minutes, but afterward, something in me shifted. I started paying closer attention, noticing the tone of her voice when she asked for help, how it would soften, almost pleading, like she knew exactly which strings to pull. I began to wonder if these emergencies were truly as sudden as she made them seem, or if she had learned that I was an always open lifeline. One evening, I shared a sliver of my doubts with my closest friend, Marcia. She listened quietly, then said, "If you keep giving without boundaries, she has no reason to stop taking." Her words felt like standing in front of a mirror, for the first time in years, seeing myself clearly and not entirely liking what I saw. Still, the guilt was relentless. Every time I thought about saying no, 1,000 images of my daughter's childhood rushed in. Her scraped knees, her first heartbreak, the times she'd run into my arms like I was her whole world. How could I refuse someone I had sworn to protect? So I didn't. I kept helping, kept transferring, kept swallowing my doubts. But by then, a quiet part of me knew. The balance between us had shifted, and it wasn't going to right itself on its own. The second year's turning point didn't announce itself with drama or shouting. It came quietly, through the slow accumulation of sacrifices I was making for her, without her ever asking me to notice them. It was late spring, and I was sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by a stack of unopened bills. My paycheck had just come in, but by the time I covered my mortgage, utilities, and the transfer I'd already promised my daughter, there was barely enough left for groceries. I stared at the numbers, feeling the weight of them settle in my chest. I had never thought of myself as someone who lived paycheck to paycheck, but lately, it was starting to feel that way. Not because my income had changed. No, because hers and her spending had somehow become my responsibility. That month, her request was bigger than usual. She told me her car was on the verge of being repossessed. Without it, she'd lose her job. The urgency in her voice left no room for hesitation. I moved money from my emergency savings, a fund I'd built carefully over years, and sent it to her that same afternoon. When I logged into my account afterward, I felt hollow. I had just taken a chunk out of my own security net, a net I might need someday. But the thought that kept playing in my head was, if I don't help her, she might lose everything. That was the beginning of the real strain. I started saying no to myself before I even considered saying no to her. I skipped the weekend trips I used to take, delayed a long overdue repair on my own car, and told friends I was too busy to go out, when the truth was, I couldn't afford to. And yet, the calls kept coming. There was one in July that still makes my stomach turn. She rang me crying, saying her electricity had been shut off. I sent the payment immediately, picturing her sitting alone in the dark. But 2 days later, she posted a series of photos from a beach trip with friends, laughing, sunburned, holding a drink with a paper umbrella. I told myself maybe the trip had been planned long before the bill problem. Maybe she went along because her friends had already paid. The mental gymnastics I performed to justify these moments could have won medals. By the end of that summer, I noticed something I couldn't ignore anymore. My resentment was growing, not toward her entirely, at least not yet, but toward the situation, toward the fact that I was struggling in ways I hadn't in years, all while she seemed to live with bursts of comfort and indulgence that didn't line up with the stories she told me. It was a dangerous mix, resentment and love. Because resentment makes you want to pull back, but love keeps you tethered. And I was still firmly on the line, even as it cut deeper into my hands. The first time I truly noticed her lifestyle shifting, it hit me like a quiet slap. Unexpected, but sharp enough to sting. It was early autumn, and I'd just wired her another few $100s for what she described as unavoidable medical expenses. I imagined her eating plain soup in a dimly lit apartment, counting coins for bus fare. But later that week, scrolling through her social media, I saw photos of her at a friend's wedding. Hair professionally styled, wearing a brand new dress that looked far from bargain bin. She was glowing, champagne flute in hand, surrounded by laughter. I sat there with my phone in my hand, blinking at the screen. The pictures didn't match the voice I'd heard on the phone days earlier, tight, anxious, desperate. And it wasn't just a one-time thing. Over the next few months, more moments like that surfaced. She'd call about needing rent money, and a week later, there'd be posts of her dining out at trendy restaurants. She'd say her car repairs had drained her account, then show up in photos from weekend getaways. I told myself she deserved joy, that maybe these outings were rare splurges, funded by friends or special occasions. But with each inconsistency, the knot in my chest tightened. One evening in November, I decided to stop guessing and start paying closer attention. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I began noticing the patterns, the timing of her emergencies, how often they coincided with events she clearly enjoyed. It was subtle, but it was there, like a rhythm I hadn't heard before. The part that unsettled me most wasn't just the money, it was the way her demeanor shifted depending on the conversation. When she needed help, her voice softened, laced with vulnerability. When she didn't, she was breezy, distracted, like I was just another item on her to-do list. One weekend, I stopped by her apartment unannounced. She was surprised to see me, but invited me in. That's when I saw it. A brand new flat-screen TV mounted on the wall. I knew she hadn't had one the last time I visited. My eyes flicked to the glossy designer handbag hanging from a chair. I didn't ask questions. I couldn't. My throat felt too tight. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and replayed the past 2 years in my mind. I thought about all the times I'd cut corners, skipped meals out, postponed my own needs, just to keep her afloat. And I wondered, for the first time, if afloat was even the right word. Because from where I was standing, she wasn't barely surviving. She was comfortable, maybe even thriving. And if that was true, then what exactly was I paying for? I'd been dancing around the questions in my mind for months, but there came a point when I couldn't keep quiet any longer. It was a gray January morning when my phone lit up with her name. She said she needed help covering a late utility bill. Urgent, of course. But something in her tone felt different this time. It wasn't the usual soft plea. It was sharper, rushed, like she was impatient for me to just agree. As I listened, I felt a tension building in my chest. My eyes wandered to the list I'd been keeping in my notebook. Dates, amounts, and brief notes on what each transfer was supposedly for. It wasn't meticulous bookkeeping, but it was enough to see the pattern clearly. Before I could stop myself, I asked, "Honey, can you walk me through where all this is going? I just want to make sure I understand." There was a pause. A long one. When she finally spoke, her voice had cooled a few degrees. "Are you saying you don't trust me?" The question caught me off guard. I scrambled to soften my tone. "No, it's not that. Well, it's been a lot lately, and I need to make sure I'm keeping up on my own bills too." She sighed heavily, the sound dripping with frustration. "I don't have time for this, Mom. If you can't help, just say so." The conversation ended abruptly. I sat there, staring at my silent phone, feeling the weight of what had just happened. This was the first time I'd ever pushed back, even slightly, and her reaction had been hostile, defensive. Over the next week, our contact was minimal. She didn't send her usual little check-in texts, didn't call just to talk. The silence between us felt like a punishment, and I hated how much it hurt. I found myself tempted to send her money just to bridge the gap, to restore the warmth that had cooled overnight. But I didn't. Instead, I kept replaying the conversation, wondering why a simple question had felt like a threat to her. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed that the money had become something unspoken between us, part of the structure of our relationship, not just an occasional necessity. And by questioning it, I had shaken the foundation she'd built on my willingness to give. Still, I wasn't ready to believe the worst. I told myself maybe she was stressed, maybe she'd had a bad day. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. Not just in her, but in me. I had stepped over an invisible line, and now, whether I liked it or not, I was closer to the truth than I'd ever been. The truth didn't come crashing down all at once. It slipped in sideways, disguised as coincidence. It was a Saturday afternoon when I ran into an old acquaintance, someone I hadn't seen in years. We were both in line at the bakery, making small talk, when they mentioned, completely out of the blue, that they'd seen my daughter recently. "Oh, really?" I asked, my voice casual, though my heart sped up. "Yeah," they said with a smile. "She looked great, said she'd just gotten back from a trip to Cabo. Sounded like she had the time of her life." Cabo. The word lodged in my mind like a splinter. My daughter had never mentioned any trip. In fact, the week she would have been gone was the same week she'd called me crying about an unexpected rent hike and begged me to cover the difference. I'd wired the money without a second thought. I felt my face flush. I managed to smile and nod at my acquaintance, pretending everything was fine. But my hands shook as I carried my bread and coffee back to the car. In the quiet of my parked car, I scrolled through her social media, looking for any sign of the trip. Nothing. No beach photos, no cocktails by the pool, which, in its own way, made it worse. It meant she had deliberately chosen not to share it with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of her laughing on a sunlit beach kept surfacing, colliding with the memory of her tearful voice asking for help. I started to wonder how many other moments there had been, how many other stories I'd bought into without question. A few days later, fate handed me another clue. I was at the grocery store when I overheard two women chatting in the next aisle. One mentioned a boutique opening in town and how my daughter had been there for the launch party, wearing a stunning outfit that had probably cost a fortune. I froze in place, my hand on a box of pasta. The details didn't add up anymore, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized they hadn't been adding up for a long time. That was when I knew I couldn't just sit back and wait for the truth to find me. I was going to have to go looking for it myself. I didn't know exactly what I'd uncover, but something deep inside me, the part that had been quiet for far too long, was finally stirring awake, and it was ready to start asking the questions I'd been too afraid to face. Once the seed of suspicion was planted, it grew fast, twisting through every thought, wrapping around every memory. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them from her directly. I started small, quiet. The first thing I did was comb through our old messages, years of texts and call logs, looking for patterns I'd been too blinded by love to see. I noticed that her emergencies often came just before weekends or holidays. Some months, the urgent bills she mentioned in January were suspiciously similar to the ones she'd had in September. Then, I checked my bank records, lining up every transfer with the dates she'd given me stories. That's when it really hit me. The sums weren't just frequent, they were growing. $100 here in the early days had become $300, $500, sometimes more. And each time, the urgency was paired with the same tone. Soft, pleading, with just enough pressure to make me feel like saying no would be cruel. But I didn't stop there. I began talking to people, carefully, without tipping my hand. A neighbor of hers mentioned seeing her come home with shopping bags often. A mutual friend of ours mentioned a new laptop she'd been using, though she'd told me her old one was barely hanging on and needed replacing. Money I had, of course, sent her for. The worst came when I overheard two co-workers at the cafe, where I sometimes had breakfast. They were talking about that girl who always tips big at the bar downtown, and when they said her name, my fork froze halfway to my mouth. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. She wasn't drowning. She wasn't scraping by. She was living, comfortably, on a mix of her own income and my steady stream of unquestioned support. And the more I learned, the more it seemed like she had mastered the art of making me believe I was saving her, when in truth, I was funding her lifestyle. I didn't want to believe it. Every new detail felt like a betrayal layered on top of the last, but I couldn't deny what I was seeing. One night, I sat in my dimly lit living room, the notebook of dates and amounts open on my lap. I stared at the numbers until they blurred, my hands shaking. The ache in my chest wasn't just from the money. It was from the realization that my love, my trust, had been used as a kind of currency. And now, I had to decide what to do with the truth I'd gathered. Keep it to myself, keep paying, keep pretending, or confront her and risk the kind of fracture you can't tape back together? Either way, I knew there was no going back to the person I'd been before. The truth didn't just arrive, it crashed down, shattering the last fragile pieces of denial I'd been clinging to. It happened on a rainy Thursday evening. I was making dinner when my phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcia, my closest friend. No words, just a link to a public photo album from someone's party downtown. I almost didn't click it. But when I did, my breath caught. There she was, my daughter, center frame in several photos. She was dressed in a shimmering cocktail dress I'd never seen before, hair styled to perfection, laughing with a glass of champagne in hand. In one shot, she was holding a designer handbag that I knew cost more than I'd spent on groceries that entire month. The timestamp on the album made my stomach turn. It was from the same night she had called me sobbing, saying her heating system had broken and she couldn't afford the repair. I'd sent her $450 that night, worried she'd be freezing in her apartment. I scrolled further. More photos, different events. The dates lined up with other emergency calls, days when she had told me she couldn't pay for basic necessities, but was instead out at expensive restaurants, on weekend trips, and attending ticketed events that cost more than some of my utility bills. The final blow came from an unexpected source. My sister. She had run into my daughter at a boutique downtown, carrying several shopping bags. When my sister asked how she was doing, my daughter smiled and said, "Oh, great! I'm lucky to have extra cash to treat myself lately. Extra cash. That phrase kept echoing in my head, twisting deeper every time. I spent that night at my dining table, with every piece of evidence laid out: screenshots, bank records, dates, receipts. My heart was pounding, not with anger, but with something heavier. The weight of knowing that the person I had sacrificed for, gone without for, and defended endlessly, had been lying to me. This wasn't just about money, it was about trust. The kind of trust you give without hesitation to your own child. And she had turned it into a tool, something to be leveraged. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, watching the rain streak down the window, trying to decide whether confronting her would be an act of strength, or the beginning of the end. But deep down, I knew I couldn't carry this truth in silence any longer. I didn't plan some grand confrontation. There was no rehearsed speech, no perfect moment. It happened because I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I called her on a Sunday afternoon. My hands were trembling so badly, I had to put my coffee down before I spilled it. She answered on the second ring, cheerful at first, until she heard my voice. "We need to talk," I said. She laughed lightly, as if to diffuse the tension. "Okay, what's up?" I didn't ease into it. "I know about Cabo. I know about the parties, the shopping trips, the dinners. I know that some of the nights you told me you couldn't pay for heat or groceries. You were out spending money like you had more than enough." There was silence on the line. For a second, I thought she'd hung up. Then came the sharp exhale. "Who told you that?" she demanded. "It doesn't matter who told me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've seen the photos. I've talked to people. I've gone over every transfer I've sent you these past 3 years. And it doesn't add up. Not unless you've been lying to me." Her tone hardened. "So you've been spying on me now?" "I've been trying to understand why I've been draining my savings while you're living like nothing's wrong." My voice cracked, not from anger, but from the grief of saying it out loud. "Do you have any idea what I've gone without so you could have that life?" She fired back quickly, her words like little darts. "I didn't ask you to sacrifice. You offered. And yeah, maybe I didn't tell you everything, but I knew you'd overreact, just like this." Overreact. That word lit something in me I didn't know was still burning. For months, I'd been choking down my doubts, swallowing my questions, convincing myself I was imagining things. And here she was, brushing it off like my pain was an inconvenience. "I can't do this anymore," I said quietly. "Not like this. If you need help, it has to be real help, not a story you've crafted to get what you want. Because this is not love. This is manipulation." Her voice went icy. "If that's how you see it, maybe we shouldn't talk for a while." And just like that, the line went dead. I sat there, phone still in my hand, staring at the blank screen. My chest felt hollow, but in a strange way, lighter. For the first time in years, I'd drawn a line. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't unsee the truth. The days after our confrontation felt strangely quiet. Not just in my house, but in my head. For 3 years, my life had been shaped around the rhythm of her calls, the emergencies, the transfers. Now, there was nothing. No pings from my phone, no last-minute pleas. At first, it felt like standing in the middle of an empty room, unsure whether to savor the silence or fear it. I kept checking my bank account out of habit, half expecting another withdrawal. But instead, I watched my balance hold steady for the first time in years. I paid my bills without juggling due dates. I bought groceries without calculating every item in my cart. And slowly, I began to realize how much of my own stability I had traded away to maintain hers. It wasn't just financial, it was emotional. I started reclaiming the parts of my life I'd been neglecting. I joined a small gardening club in the neighborhood, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the time for. I visited the library more often, taking home books that had nothing to do with budgeting or self-help, just stories that let me escape for a while. The first real test came about a month later. My phone lit up with her name. For a second, my heart jumped in that old, familiar way. I answered, bracing myself. Her voice was softer this time. "Hey, I know things got tense. I'm sorry about how it went down." She paused, then added, "I could really use a little help this month, just until I get back on track." It would have been so easy to slip back into the pattern, to convince myself it was just this once, that maybe the confrontation had been enough to change things. But I remembered the late nights, the bills I'd shuffled, the vacations I'd canceled. I remembered the photos, the lies, the hollow feeling in my chest when I realized I'd been funding more than survival. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice steady. "I can't do that anymore. Not unless I know exactly where it's going. And even then, it has to be something real, something urgent. I can't be your safety net for choices you're not telling me about." She was quiet for a long time before finally saying, "I get it." When the call ended, I didn't cry. I didn't feel guilty. I felt free, like I'd stepped out from under a shadow I hadn't even realized was swallowing my light. And maybe that was the lesson I'd been avoiding all along. Loving someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself until there's nothing left. The months that followed moved at a slower, softer pace. Without the constant urgency of her calls, my days began to stretch out, unhurried. Mornings became quieter. No phone lighting up before I'd even had my coffee. No mental math about how much I could spare. I started noticing the little things again. The way the sunlight spilled across my kitchen counter. The gentle creak of my favorite chair when I sat with a book. The smell of bread baking from the bakery down the street. They weren't big, dramatic changes. Just small, steady moments that felt like mine again. My relationship with my daughter didn't disappear, but it changed. The first few conversations after I set boundaries were awkward, clipped. There was space between us now. Space that used to be filled with my willingness to rescue her at any cost. At first, that distance felt like loss, but over time, I realized it was actually giving both of us room to see each other more clearly. She never outright admitted to the lies, but her calls became less about money and more about the little things, work stories, friends, even the weather. And while I didn't know if that was progress or just avoidance, I was grateful for the shift. Financially, I began repairing the damage. My emergency fund started to grow again, little by little. I treated myself to things I'd denied for years. Not extravagantly, but deliberately. A weekend trip to the coast. A good winter coat that actually kept me warm. Fresh flowers on my dining table, just because. And yet, every now and then, a flicker of sadness would surface. Not for the money I'd lost, but for the trust that had been fractured. I knew it would never be the same, not in the way I'd once believed it to be. But maybe that was the point. Maybe love wasn't about keeping someone from ever falling. Maybe it was about knowing when to step back and let them find their own ground, even if they stumbled. On a quiet evening in early spring, I found myself sitting on my porch, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching the last bit of daylight fade. The air was cool, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no heaviness in my chest. I thought about those 3 years, about the choices I'd made, the truths I'd learned, and the strength it had taken to finally say enough. And I realized I wasn't just moving forward. I was letting go. Letting go of the guilt. Letting go of the role I'd played for too long. Letting go of the version of me who thought love meant carrying every burden alone. So, to you, wherever you are, however you found this story, thank you for walking through it with me. Thank you for reading the whole story. Hope you will support my next products.